First of all, thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm thrilled that you accepted our invitation. And just to give you guys a bit of background on why we brought Kentaro here is that a few months ago, I think I told a few of you when you came to the Salon a couple of weeks back that I've started this new initiative called Prosperity to Commons International, which looks to leverage a lot of the technologies that we look at in our program and think about community ownership and alleviating poverty in environmentally stressed parts of the world. And my partner in this initiative knew Kentaro before, and he told me, hey, he's got a new book out. And so I immediately looked it up. And as I was reading the synopsis, I was thinking, wow, we're looking for a common book for this year. This might fall perfectly into what we want to explore. And so I bought it immediately on Kindle. I didn't go to the library, I bought it. and then I shared it with my colleagues, Scott and Anita, and they agreed that we should make this common book. And I think it just speaks really nicely to where we stand with our program, which began in 2002 as primarily as a digital media program, and it was really trying to figure out where we're headed with communication, with technology at its base. And over the last few years, we've seen the transition and the move away. As digital becomes so pervasive, it dissolves, but we're still focused from a conversation point of view on the technology as opposed to what it's truly doing. And especially with the Arab Spring and a few other major events, I feel like we've gotten the conversation wrong. We should be having a different kind of conversation. So when I read this, it was light bulbs went off like crazy, and that's why we decided to share it with our community. And it's resonated really well, and I'm pleased that we've had so many people here. So I know you've met everybody already, Kentaro, but just for the camera and just to re-emphasize, we've got a nice mix of people here. We've got a number of our students who've joined the program in the last few months from cohort 15 for communication leadership. We've got a cohort 14, cohort 13. You didn't meet Joel, but Joel is a former journalist now, right, Joel? Yeah. Yeah. You met Sheethal, who's our PhD student, and Linda, and Nick, and obviously, and Kentaro actually has a pre-existing relationship with this young man, James, who's from the Gates Foundation. Can you just quickly talk about what you do, James, at the Gates Foundation, and why this is relevant to you?
Yeah, I mean, we work on technology solutions, in particular in payment systems. And so, I mean, I think there's a need to sort of have this conversation about what is the appropriate role of technology in development.
So with that, I'm just going to ask, I have 3 or 4 questions written down, and then you guys just chime in and yell them out. This is really informal. This is not meant to be for television or anything like that. It's just YouTube. So, Kentaro,
Just YouTube.
One of the reasons why it did resonate with me so much, Kentaro, is that I'm an early adopter of technology myself, and I was very optimistic about what this technology brought to us back in 2005, 6, 7, 8, and felt like the world was going to change for good, and we would upset the old order and be able to think more holistically about our relationships, and that has not come to be. So what was your own transition? You were in technology as well at Microsoft Research. Why did you all of a sudden feel like you had to be a heretic?
Well, you know, I went to India to try to see if there are ways to use digital technology to solve problems of the developing world. And after doing, 50-odd such projects, I came to the conclusion that it was never the technology that caused a positive outcome. It was always, a human institution. We had some positive impact, and we had a lot of indifferent impact. And the positive impact always came because we worked with partners who were amazing. And so this idea that somehow you can invent a technology that will solve human problems just seemed obviously wrong to me. It's not that the technology can't help, but the first thing that's required is a foundation of human goodwill and capacity.
So the way you explain it in the book seems so obvious now, but we seem to be exactly doing the opposite of what you've written about.
Right.
Where does this technology solutionism come from?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there are so many different, forces that are psychological and social in nature in where we end up getting excited about technology. So one of them is just, I think human beings are hardwired to be fascinated by new, shiny objects, right? So I have a 1-year-old son now, and what's interesting to me is that he gets bored of things very quickly, right? You give him a new toy, and then 2 days later, he's no longer interested in that. His senses are constantly out for whatever is new out there in the world. And the reality is there is a 1-year-old in all of us, right? And so every release of a new eye gadget gets us excited because it's just human nature to be excited about it. So I think that's one. The the more wonky side of these things is that technologies are very visible because there's a hardware artifact, right, that you can look at. And what that means is you can count them. And the kind of people who want to cause large-scale social change want to be able to count their impact, right? And so it's a lot easier to count 100,000 laptops distributed to a bunch of children than it is to count the number of children who have become self-starting, curious learners. And so there's a natural tendency right now. People talk about big data and everything. There's a natural tendency to go towards the data that you can see rather than the data that's important that it's harder to measure.
So it's an easy measurement that allows people to say we've succeeded, right?
Right.
In fact, sometimes I say, when I look at us, all of us, you've seen pictures even on social media over the last few days where an artist has actually removed these images, they've removed the smart devices from the images, and all of a sudden you're looking at couples in bed staring at their hands, right? And I kind of think, to me,
That's interesting.
When I look at these devices and the way we rely on them so much right now, and you look at people walking on campus with them, I feel like they're 21st century cigarettes. But when you watch Mad Men and how they use cigarettes, it's such an aberration, it's weird, and I feel like we'll look back on 2014, 15 and say, wow, I can tell that era because we were so wedded to these things.
Of course, by then we'll have these brain-to-brain transmitters.
That's right. But this notion, what I think, as I tried to sort of really hone in on what you were trying to say, and I've actually started quoting you widely because I think it's so true, this notion of the law of amplification, that you basically say all technology really does is amplify the existing human forces for good or for evil. So you could be the Empire, we're talking about Star Wars, and all of a sudden you build a Death Star and you can destroy people, or you can help people with whatever, Uber or whatever else. Is the law of amplification a pre-existing law, or did you make it up?
It's been around. I mean, it has been stated and restated in various forms in various communities. But what's really interesting to me is that no one discipline has turned it into a real theory of technology in society, despite the fact that many people have mentioned it over and over. And I think part of it is that it seems too simple, right? And academics like things where they can claim that they found something innovative and new, and so they don't like simple ideas because it seems like it's too simple, anybody could have thought of it, how can this possibly be academically interesting? But the interesting thing about amplification is that if you just follow it through to its logical conclusions, it actually leads to lots of interesting counterintuitive results. For example, I've run into a lot of people who say, oh yeah, of course, technology amplifies, human forces. It's just a tool. Tools amplify people. They get that. And then at the same time, they think, but we're going to use this tool and we're going to spread it everywhere to eliminate inequality, right? And to me, those two things cannot be true at the same time, because if a tool is amplifying underlying human forces, then that means anybody who already has existing advantages can use the tool even better. And so in an absolute sense, an even dissemination of technology actually further increases underlying social inequalities, right? And so I think that's the kind of thing where I'm putting more of the emphasis on those counterintuitive results, because otherwise people just think, oh, this is obvious. I hear all the time, oh, this is so obvious. Why does it need to be said? So well, it's obvious, but you have Mark Zuckerberg saying that he's going to end inequality on the planet by spreading the internet to everybody. Yeah.
And that's why one of the examples I totally love from the book. We get so enamored with the platitudes of these TED Talks, right, which are very techno-optimistic. You put this into a community in India, all of a sudden they're teaching themselves how to use a computer and everything's solved.
Right.
But people don't go past those headlines usually.
Yes, that's right.
And so you went past those headlines very specifically. I think it was the hole in the wall example, which won the TED Prize a few years ago.
Exactly.
But what were you finding in those kinds of extra investigations?
I mean, so I find that among my colleagues who do work with with impoverished communities, that if you do the work with enough honesty and open eyes, you can't but come to this conclusion, which is to say that the technology by itself does not solve really deep social problems. And one of the things I've discovered in talking about the book to various audiences is that the closer you are to the actual work on the ground, the more you intuitively understand the point. And it's so obvious to them, they're like, we agree that it's obvious. The real problem is our managers and our leaders don't get it. And so, I thought your program is very interesting because it's called communication leadership. But I think what we need is leadership communication. How do we communicate to leaders in such a way that it gets across to them? I actually gave a talk at the Gates Foundation. I said, and there were some people in the audience who were saying exactly this. And I said, I think you guys need to hold an intervention. but we'll see whether that happens.
Yeah, because they're in love with it over there for sure.
At various levels. I mean, it's different. I think Bill Gates is extremely smart, and his approach is to solve problems as he hits them. So in some areas that he works in, he's come to the realization that you have to address the human institutions.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to have generalized across different areas in which he does the work. And so there's still some areas in which the technology is still the primary driver, whereas in other areas I think he's really coming to understand just how much the human institutions are important.
Well, either in our defense or our promotion, I think what we've recognized as we've also made our own transition in our program is that the technology is interesting and important, and there's certainly a catalyzing factor in what is happening in the world. But what it has revealed is that fundamentally the currency in communication for professionals, and these are all professionals, is in the relational aspect. And that's why we added a second degree to our program a few years ago in communities and networks, because that recognized that relational part.
Right.
The technology may amplify it,
right,
but it's not the sole thing there. That's so. Right. I hope that we're kind of on the same page.
No, I think we are. I mean, one of the examples I always give is, these days anybody can write an email to the President of the United States, but that doesn't mean you're going to get a response, right? The people who get the response are the same people who got the response before email.
That's a good point. That's a good way of putting it. So I just asked a few questions to get things going, but I'm happy to have you guys ask anything you want.
Just wanted to follow up on that. You're talking about communications to leaders, but also communications to companies, right? Sure. So right now there's all this push about entering emerging markets. Microsoft has the Continuum that they think is going to revolutionize the mobile industry, using that as a computer in the developing world. But then should these companies be looking at what you're saying, where they should be investing also in people rather than just the technology that they're going to put out there?
Right. I think in an ideal world something like that would happen, but I think modern corporations are amazingly not interested in investing in human beings, and that's just always been the case. I think as far as as far as modern capitalism goes, and so expecting corporations to do it for us, I think would be nice if they did it, but I don't think it's actually going to happen. I think the best way to change these things is actually let corporations do what they do well, which is to make money. But then we have to focus on social policies such that that money is taxed at a sufficiently progressive way that the benefits that the corporations get out of serving the larger public go back to the public.
So I started off as a Peace Corps volunteer, and so when I got into technology and development, I was already pretty cynical about the role that it could actually play.
Oh, okay, that's interesting, yeah.
But I became more optimistic, actually. So I think I now kind of identify with the camp of being a techno-optimist.
Okay.
Maybe.
In what way exactly?
I believe that technology has a way of amplifying social change, and that if you choose the right kinds of technologies and the right kinds of interventions, then you can actually affect large changes. And so I know that you say something about that already, but maybe make a finer point about the leverage points that you think are there, because I think maybe one perspective is there are certain technologies that if you get the right ones, then you actually have a good leverage point.
So I think that's the dream, and I just don't believe that that's the case. I agree with the first half of what you said, which is that technologies can amplify social change. The challenge is that they amplify good and bad social change. And especially with digital technologies, because they're so powerful, it is very difficult to design a technology which can only amplify the positive side. As you strip down the power, they become less and less interesting and powerful as technologies, right? So there was something interesting that you said in the second half of your statement, which was, if we focus on the right kinds of technologies and the right kinds of interventions, then the right thing will happen. And I think there's a critical thing that is missing in that statement, which is what you should really be doing is focusing on the right kind of people. Because I believe you can take any technology and find a good way to use it if you work with the right human beings. Right? On the other hand, if you get the wrong human beings, you can take any technology and they can do terrible things. And so this is in some ways the core point of the book is that technology amplifying people doesn't say that technology is useless, right? I mean, amplifications are powerful, right? It doesn't say that technology is bad. I'm not saying that either. All I'm saying is that, in a way, it's like, technology is the engine in your car, and people are the driver, right? Well, it's great to have a great engine, but if the person doesn't know where he's going, or if the driver is a terrible driver, then
Or the car's a tank.
and the car's tank. I mean, so you got all the power, but if it's being misused or incompetently used, then that's potentially worse than if you didn't have the power to begin with, right? And so, my emphasis is always on, if you're going to build a powerful engine, make sure it goes to the people that you want to have that kind of power, or help build and nurture the capacity to be good drivers who know where they're going. If you do that, I think technology is wonderful. I think in some funny way, exactly because we live in a world in which we have so much technology, we kind of don't have to worry about the technology so much. We want all of our kind of public sector and nonprofit attention to go to nurturing human beings, because if you get that part right, they'll automatically use the technology we already have and make it do amazing things.
Shifa, did I see your hand up?
I did. I had a question a little bit about what you were talking about earlier around the evaluation and impact elements. Naturally and understandably, these organizations that are out there doing this ICT for development have the need, desire, and kind of need to show what was the impact of this work that we've done.
Right.
And so, to your point, that you can count computers.
Yes.
In your framework, how do we think about evaluation and impact? How do we translate this kind of mentality around really thinking about the social in a way that then a nonprofit or the Gates Foundation can turn around and show what the meaning of that?
So I think there's at least two different levels of response to that. So the one thing is, even if it's a project involving technology, the end goal is what you want to measure, right? So for example, let's say you're trying to deliver more financial services through technology. And I believe that there are some ways in which that can happen. Well, assuming that your end goal is to help make people wealthier or become more entrepreneurial or something, then that's what you should measure with the change in technology. And if that outcome doesn't happen, or it's hard to see, then one question is, are you sure that technology is really having the impact that you want it to have? Just counting the technology is, just like you're saying, counting that intermediate result without getting to the final outcome. The other side of it is that, goes back to this question of measurability. But there are lots of things that we care about that are just very, very hard to measure. And we're moving into a world in which everybody thinks measuring is the end-all and be-all of decision making. But the reality is we're never going to be able to measure everything that we really care about. And so what that means is we have to be very conscious of the fact that those things we can measure are really only a small subset of the larger things we care about. And so when you make a decision, anytime you make a decision based on data, you are ignoring some portion of stuff that is hard to turn into data, right? But which is still important. I think what that means is, one thing about that is that it's actually job security for human beings, because it means human subjective judgment is always going to be important, right? And even in a world in which we have, all the data that, we could possibly dream about. But I worry that in the same context in which all the technology is advancing, we're also increasingly kind of saying, we want to make decisions without having to use our brains, right? And I think that's not a good direction. If anything, we need more brain power to counteract the amazing amount of data that we now have.
Were you going to ask a question? Is that what you had your finger up?
Yeah. We'll switch roles.
Yep.
So we're looking at like a continuum of how we might provide education from schooling. You've done work with TAF. You've written about a SESHI. My research is looking how to connect informal learning environments to more formal learning environments, so teachers have a scope and sense of what students can do outside of class, where they seem to be more motivated.
Right.
So now that you're in the realm of dean of an iSchool at a major R1 institution, how do you think about the role? I mean, education in many ways, we saw manufacturing, we saw auto industry, we saw newspapers all go through these transformations.
Right.
We're sort of in that now with higher
Right.
education, and MOOCs ain't going to save
Right,
us.
right, exactly.
And I'm not sure what will save us, but from what your standpoint, what are some of the things that we might be able to implement that actually creates more equitable excellence and accessible education? Those three.
So first, let me just correct. I'm an associate professor
Okay.
at the School of Information, not the dean. But and then, yeah, as for the last question, I would say the only thing that makes education more equitable is a more equitable distribution of good, high-quality adult guidance, or in a university environment, high-quality mentorship. Everything else ends up getting amplified, right? So if you start off with an uneven distribution of quality adult guidance in education, then what happens is the technology helps the kids who have more of that to begin with, right? So this happens in very obvious ways. So for example, take a kid who is about to enter into kindergarten. Well, we already know that there's a huge disparity in how much kids learn by the time they're in kindergarten, right? Some adults, some parents read to their kids since the moment they're born. Some parents don't read to their kids until, maybe they never read to their kids. So by the time they're 6 years old, there's a huge disparity in how much they can read. Well, now you give both kids a computer. Who is going to be able to take more advantage of the computer? Obviously the child who can read already. And they're going to learn more and more faster. And now that the information is readily available in digital form, they can learn whatever they want to learn even faster than they could have before. And so in an absolute sense, that initial gap becomes even greater with an even distribution of technology. I'm not even dealing with a digital divide, right? With a digital divide, the kids who are privileged have even more technology to begin with, and so that's even, it creates even more of a gap. But the only way you can counteract that is for there to be more equitable distribution of good adult guidance from the beginning. So I believe in all these efforts recently to kind of focus on early childhood education and getting that to kids who are not from privileged backgrounds. I think that's absolutely important. In fact, I think as far as education goes, at least in the United States, we generally do not have to worry about education for rich families, right? Those kids are going to find some way to get a good education and end up with decent jobs. The real problem is how do we educate the kids who are not coming from well-educated, families, or who have the wealth to be able to send their kids to the best schools in their neighborhoods and so on. That disparity is purely a political question of how do we distribute educational resources and primarily good teachers. I think one of the worst things we do in this country is we pay for our public education with local property taxes, which means that if you are born in a poor neighborhood, you will get much less education than somebody who comes from a rich neighborhood.
So to kind of pick up on that, you were right, it's absolutely a political issue, but in our current political atmosphere, and you talked about it in your book in terms of like the way social media and technologies amplify that division between, we'll just use Democrats and Republicans right now. How do you actually get anything done? Like if you recognize it's a political issue and the state of which we live in is one of derision, shall we say, and the lack of cooperation. Even in Washington State, it's kind of, the federal system is basically mirrored to Washington's legislative system as well. How can you really, really get things done? Do you take part in that system, try to fix the system, or go around the system?
I do not know.
Come on, we're looking for all the answers, man.
But I do think that whatever the answer is, it will be intensely social and relationship oriented, right? It will be, more individuals like us reaching across the aisle and trying to have real conversations with people we might disagree with politically. I think a lot of it is what you're talking about, which is there's mutual derision. At this point, we constantly think the other side is stupid, and that is not productive.
It's true.
And the technology, certainly amplifies that as well, right? Now we're just trying to take, pot shots at insulting each other. I think it's a hard place to get out of, but I don't think it gets solved until we solve the problem of thinking, the other side is stupid.
Well, it seems to me that we have to have the necessary hard talk now about the role of technology in our lives, and I don't think we're doing that. We're so enamored with the convenience and the allure of these technologies, especially with the Internet of Things coming at us really fast, that we haven't actually asked ourselves: do we as a society really want this to happen? I think embodiment of this conversation that is happening at a certain level is about the role of Uber and its disruptive forces on taxi cabs and what's important to us as a society. So how do we actually have this hard talk amongst ourselves?
Again, I have no idea. I mean, you guys are the communication department, right? I think it's a communication issue. I think it's a relationship building issue. It's a community building issue. Excuse me. We need to build more communities that include people from different political.
Don't take a breath. It's okay. take a water.
It's the nature of the conversation.
Yeah, I choked him up.
It's such a difficult conversation.
Darth Vader.
Put your mind tricks away.
Sorry.
So, I mean, this is kind of getting into an interesting space, which is, and I'm not a communications person, but it seems like there are dominant narratives in society, and then you might be one of these people who have a counter narrative. How do those counter narratives sort of take shape and get out there and become, like, how does that actually manifest? You've seen it. You've written your books. People are talking about it in some places. How do you go from there?
So I think it's two things. So one is there is an underlying, psychological landscape, right, that you have to understand exists and you have to contend with. Which is to say, if there's some reason why people don't want to believe it, then you are climbing an uphill, mountain.
Like climate change.
Yeah, exactly. It's like climate. And as I was saying before, we all have this. We get excited by shiny new gadgets syndrome. I mean, there's a part of the brain that is constantly looking for new stimulus, and so. In some sense, it's difficult to go against that. I mean, I know people who who will say, look, intellectually, I understand everything that you're saying, and it makes sense to me, but I still get excited about the technology, right? And that is deeply in our psyches. And the only solution to that is having enough of a. When I say education, I don't necessarily mean like formal school education, but enough of a upbringing and education where we become good enough at critical thinking that we can override some of these emotional impulses, right? So, for example, I am very conscious that if I have a smartphone, I will end up doing this all day. So I don't.
Whoa.
Right? This is the same for 10 years. And,
what is that?
Exactly. And it does voice calls, which is really what I need. It also has SMS. But this is enough for me. And I know if I went to a smartphone, I will lose a couple hours every day in terms of.
So you'd be less smart.
I'd be smarter at something else possibly, but not the things that I think I want to be smart at. So I think we have to make those kinds of decisions.
I have another question that kind of goes with that, which is just as an observation of being one of the first members of a thing called Social Venture Partners. Do you know about?
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of technology people who started to do philanthropy.
Right.
And originally, technology-based philanthropy was a big part of that. And I think they've gotten away from that. But I also remember in the beginning saying, shouldn't we have a party? Shouldn't we get together and talk to each other about what we're doing? And it was impossible to get these folks to have a party and just sit down and talk about what they were doing and try to figure out how they could, do things better. And so I think maybe the more we do this, maybe the less we learn how to interact socially.
I think that's happening a little bit. So among some of the undergrad students that I've taught, they actually are aware of that. They know that a lot of their communication happens over the phone, and that they sense that there's something not right about that situation. And the interesting thing about their generation is they're not quite as taken by the novelty of the gadget because they've grown up with it, right? So they don't think it's like some new fancy thing. They're kind of like us with cars. We're like, well, cars are okay, but there's lots of auto accidents. We got to be careful about that. They're a little bit more like that. Whereas I think people in my generation we grew up seeing the technology come on the scene, and so we're like, oh, this is just so amazing, and they're kind of past that.
So that gives us hope then, perhaps.
It's potentially, yeah. I mean, if they, if it didn't take too much of a hold.
That means that whatever comes next is going to grab them by the seat.
Yeah. So that exactly.
Enthusiasm that we did with the phones.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows?
Well, I think to a certain extent that's true. I mean, I know we have a few millennials here, but the millennial generation, first of all, is hard to generalize about, and secondly, could technically be broken into two. There is the millennial generation that came with Mark Zuckerberg from a web point of view, and then there is the Generation Z, which are still in their teens, that were born with mobile and have adopted a more text one-on-one approach as opposed to the machine gun sort of social media, let's hit everybody kind of thing. So I think that there's some nice sort of nuance, and there is some hope for that. I see that lunch is about to join us, so I thought maybe we just close up at least the formal part of this program on camera with just a last question is, how much is Geek Heresy resonating since you've released it?
I don't know. You tell me.
Well, it's doing very well over here in this part of the world, but I don't know. I mean, unless James can get Bill to read this during his next presentation.
Well, so, to go back to James' question, on the one hand, I think there's a psychological landscape that you have to deal with, and you have to understand that in order to try to get the message out. And then the other side is, assuming it's an uphill climb, which I believe it is in my case, you just have to pound the street and do the footwork. And so, right now I've been trying to give talks to as many audiences as possible where I think it's an important message to get through.
Is it resonating when you actually bring it to them for the first time?
It resonates, so again, most of the audiences I've spoken with have at least some sympathy with the message of the book. And they all think that I need to talk to their boss. That's the challenge.
The leadership communication thing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Kentaro Toyama, author of Geek Heresy, it's awesome. We really appreciate you being here, and thank you for making this really important work available to us.
I'm glad you're forcing your students to read my book.
Thanks. Yeah, we totally will.
And to borrow words from Linda, I think it's time to party.